It's time to take your seats, ladies and gentlemen, as we await our next speaker. She'll be talking about how IT security awareness can be tested, measured, and tracked, and why even do it. She is Cheri McGuire, the Group Chief Information Security Officer of Standard Chartered Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Cheri McGuire.
Thanks very much. Great. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here at the Singapore Fintech Festival. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the important aspect of IT security awareness, and not just training, but all the different aspects that we need to approach this issue as people are our first line of defense within our organizations. So the three pillars, the foundations of IT security, we've all talked about this if you're in the security industry for years, about people, process, and technology. And oftentimes organizations will put extreme emphasis, and I mean extreme emphasis, on only technology controls. But we also need to be focusing, of course, on process, but even more importantly on people. And I'll get to that in just a moment, of why it's so important. And the reason it's so important and why security awareness training is so important is because people actually may be your weakest link. Few of the statistics here, which I think are quite impressive, and maybe not in a good way, is that in a recent IBM report, 95% of data breaches were cited as being caused by human error. 90% of attacks occurring via phishing emails, employees and individuals clicking on malicious links. 55% of businesses suffered a data breach or a security incident in 2016, according to the Ponemon Institute, due to malicious or negligent employees. And lastly, 26% of security incidents involve sending sensitive information to the wrong person. I think it's really important to kind of sit with those statistics for a minute to think about why it's so important to think about your employees and the human element, not just as a risk factor, and that they can be one of your weakest links, but also they can be one of your biggest deterrents and one of your biggest control points within your organization. So I've put a quote here because we run a program at Standard Chartered called Information Security Champions, and this is about 850 of our employees spread across our sites all over the world, and we're in almost 70 countries. And these employees are mostly not from the security team. They're interested in security, and they're interested in risk management, and they are volunteers. But this particular quote, I thought, really captured the essence of why it's so important that we involve our employees and we look at employees as one of our biggest deterrents. Protecting the bank is a concerted effort from everyone, creating a culture within our organization that everyone has a responsibility to secure the data and our customers' assets. But more importantly, it starts with small habits that individuals can do every day, and also helping to educate our colleagues on how to identify and avoid cyber threats. Really fundamental, and I thought that that captured the essence of why it's so important to have a security culture and to drive a security culture within the organization. But one of the aspects that often gets overlooked is a one-size-fits-all approach to security awareness and training. How many of us every year take our 30-minute or 1-hour training on our computer, and that's it? And we don't think about security for the rest of the year. I think that's pretty common in most organizations. But it's really important that when you're designing your various awareness efforts, that you target them and focus them to the different audiences within your organization. Board members, for example, will need a different type of awareness training. They're going to be focused on broader risks and strategic governance versus, for example, frontline employees who might be more exposed to malicious emails or phishing attempts. And of course, one of the areas that often gets overlooked is our software developers. In the fintech community, as well as in the banking community, we have thousands and thousands of software developers, of course. And one of the things that often gets assumed is that those individuals know how to do secure coding and implement security testing as they're going about creating new products and services. So don't forget about them as well as you're developing your security training and programs. So one of the things that I'll mention, because I don't want to downplay the importance of technology controls. Of course, we all know that we have to have security controls and technology in place. That is critical from a defense and protection standpoint. But what research has shown is that there actually are a number of challenges with relying solely on security technology controls to protect our organizations. And some of the things that have been discovered are that only relying on security controls actually is rarely fully effective in the absence of training. So it's important to explain to employees what the policies are, provide them the context of why it's important that they treat information securely and manage it as such. In addition, security technology controls often lag the actual threats, both in their availability and maturity. So sometimes, of course, it might take a little longer to deploy that patch for a critical vulnerability. It might take a little longer to have that latest protection in place from your security vendor than you might like. So some of those controls oftentimes do lag the actual threats. In addition, some controls, if they prohibit or inhibit the ability of employees to share information or communicate easily within an organization, might actually reduce productivity and limit their activities and collaboration. And lastly, some security technology controls can be quite expensive to implement, particularly if you're dealing with large global legacy infrastructures, as of course many of the large financial institutions have today. Sometimes it can be quite expensive and take more time to implement. Now, I'm not discounting, again, the need for security technology controls. We absolutely need to have those. But what I am saying is that organizations today really need to rethink their approach about the human element of security. In years past, the traditional way of thinking about the human element or employees is that employees are at risk. How do we prevent our employees from doing things that we consider insecure? It's really about driving those controls and preventing them from doing things. The mindset shift that we're now trying to promote is that actually employees are controls, and we need to think about them that way. We need to think about them as how to get them actively involved to prevent and detect breaches. And so there's both an enduring aspect and a dynamic aspect of that. The enduring being asking our employees to really think like a security agent or as a control point, to really embrace that they have a role and a responsibility to play in securing the organization. Conveying that if they suspect something, they need to say something, that they should report it. They shouldn't just delete it or expect that it was nothing. There's also a dynamic aspect to this, which is as phishing attempts and attacks become much more sophisticated, having employee readiness as part of your culture is even more important. And then, of course, we're all adopting much more, at least in the financial industry, much more restrictive information classification guidelines. We have many of those today when it comes to protecting customer data, banking secrecy acts, etc. And that's an important aspect of this to ensure that our employees understand the foundation for why they have to behave the way that they do. So there's a couple of aspects that I'll cover around building an awareness program. And I'll go into a couple of these in more depth in a few slides. But just really quickly, it's very important that as you're designing these programs that you address employee psychology in your campaign design. That you adopt a risk-based approach. Some organizations may have more regulatory pressure. Other organizations may have specific risks that they're focused on. So you want to design that program to address what is your risk posture for your organization. Number 3 there is something that often gets overlooked. You want to think like a marketer. In fact, the folks on my team, many of them that run our training and awareness program, have communications and marketing backgrounds. You want to make things appealing and interesting and really try to get employees involved. You also want to develop a diverse awareness portfolio, as well as focusing on tried and tested techniques, and of course, closed loop planning. So let me just talk very briefly about how we address employee psychology in campaign design. And this is very, very important, something that often gets overlooked. And I mentioned before, there's not really a one-size-fits-all. You want to design for specific audiences within your organization. So when we think about employee psychology and attitudes when it comes to security, and this is produced by CEB, now Gartner, really want to think about what's the employee's knowledge of the policy. Do they understand it? Have you conveyed to them why they need to follow certain policies and behaviors? What's their self-interest in security? What's in it for them? Why should they care? Does it tie to their annual performance review? Their annual conduct assessments? How is that integrated into your organization? What's their perception of risk to the organization? Do they think that, IT security department's got it all figured out. I don't need to worry about it. We don't have much risk. And what's their emotional commitment to security? Some employees will be very passionate about personal protection and security issues, where others, it's something that is scary and that is very hard for them to understand. And ultimately, what is their perception of the compliance burden? How do they perceive the overall drag on productivity or the work that they need to do? Does that take away somehow doing these various steps, encrypting documents, sending securely, and so forth? Does that take away from their ability to do their job? And all of those things, when you're designing these programs, play into actual decisions by employees on whether or not they comply with your security policy and programs and the behavior that they exhibit. So I mentioned previously, think like a marketer, do audience-based design. Certainly, focusing those various campaigns or awareness sessions. The board, for example, at Standard Chartered, we do one-on-one sessions. They have some specific risks, and we go in and we talk with them one-on-one. Same with our senior executives. But we also provide in-country training and awareness that's specific to the risks of that country, and also is translated into the local language and colloquialisms. So it's very important that you ensure that you're modifying and developing your awareness materials so that they fit the audience that you're targeting. I also mentioned developing a diverse awareness portfolio. And this can take many different forms. So at Standard Chartered, some of the things that we use today, which are listed here, of course, things like physical posters and handouts and, the typical kinds of things that you would see in an organization. But we also do regular phishing tests, phishing simulations. And we measure those over time, not only what the click rate is of our employees, but also what's their reporting rate. That helps us measure how aware they are of our CIRT, our Security Incident Response Team, and whether or not we're making progress in raising that awareness level of where to report and how to respond. We also look over time at how our employees are responding so we can measure our program's impact. And that's a really important part. It's one thing to just do security awareness training, but you really want to understand what the impact is that you're having on the behaviors of your employees. So of course, there's a number of tried and tested techniques focusing on incentives, prizes, etc. But we really want to talk about not just being penalties, but how do we incentivize that good behavior? We want to keep it simple, have your employees be part of the solution, have regular communications versus one-off training. It's interesting because research has shown that one-off training versus regular communications with employees, that regular communications are actually twice as effective in creating secure behaviors. So it really is important that you maintain that engagement throughout the year. Of course, the old adage of KISS, keep it simple and secure, is really important when you're doing these types of programs with your employees. You want to make sure you're using memorable and simple catchphrases. Again, make it easy for your staff to understand and participate. We have a really simple framework that we use at Standard Chartered, and we call it the 4 S's of security: saving securely, sending securely, sharing securely, and speaking securely. Very easy to remember, very easy to also be able to share with our employees. So as I mentioned, we have lots of different examples of the types of communications and training materials that we use within Standard Chartered, from the posters to scenarios to handouts to something we call group information security tips that we run via videos. And as I mentioned earlier, all of these are driven, we scale throughout our global footprint by our information security champion network. And that's a very critical part of our program. One of the areas that we just completed, one of the focus areas that we just had, was a new gamification initiative. And this is something that's really kind of took off. We had quite good success with our employees. We ran a weekly webisodes game, if you will, where our employees were able to pick the ending of whether or not they were keeping the bank safe or whether the bad guys were winning the game. And this really got folks involved and motivated. In fact, we had 20% of the bank. This wasn't a requirement. It wasn't a mandate. This was a voluntary kind of program. 20% of the bank was participating in this. We had almost 15,000 employees that actively participated. Now, there was a little bit of a carrot there. We offered a free iPad that was at the end of every week to employees. But we also had about 2,000 submissions from employees. There was another part of the game where you could submit your own ideas. About 2,000 submissions from employees where they also got to provide feedback to us on various security ideas that they had. So you can see that the impact that you can have from an awareness perspective really can be quite broad. And using different methods and tools and techniques can get your employees really motivated. So I don't want to forget a very important aspect of any training program, and that is what I mentioned before about measuring and reporting, and what we call closed loop planning. The important aspect of this is to look at your phishing simulations, your training, your gamification, all of the different things that you're doing, and look at that on a continuous basis. So we all know about continuous improvement practices. That's pretty standard in business. But we also want to apply that to our awareness programs. And so measuring, reporting, and adapting your awareness plan is just as important. If you get midway through your year and you've just conducted a phishing simulation and your results weren't very good, you might need to take another look at what you might need to change for the rest of the year for your awareness plans to ensure that you're having the impact that you want. So it's really, really important that you do that feedback loop into your planning. And lastly, I think it's really important just to take a look at the different levels of maturing aspirations for awareness programs. There are different stages of maturity, if you will, across most organizations. The first one there is sort of the check the box. Did you run your annual training? The second is, are you really changing employee behaviors? Are they following the defined processes and adhering to those rules that you have? The third is where you're really encouraging your employees to use their best judgment. This is about them acting as a control point and really taking ownership of decisions that they're making around secure behavior. And the fourth on the scale is enabling your employees as breach detectors, that they really are the front line of your security, and that they are not only a control point, but they can actually improve your overall detection and protection rates within your organization. So I would just leave you with one thought, which is, where does your organization fit with its security awareness initiatives? And how secure are your employees behaving within your environment? Thank you very much.